For those of you who don't know me, it's very likely because I spent the majority of my ministry in the Arizona-California district. In fact, I spent 41 years in Arizona. I vicared there. That's where my wife and I started dating, and we married, and all of our children were born in Arizona. We loved the state. But after 4 decades, I received a call to Wisconsin. My wife's originally from Wisconsin, and she said, Phil, she said, you know, for 40 years we wandered in the wilderness. Can we finally go to the promised land? Well, we came to Wisconsin. I served the last 3 years of my ministry at St. Peter Freedom. And what we found out when we came to Wisconsin is that the promised land is still filled with the Canaanites, I think. I shouldn't say that. It's just that it's really been an adjustment for us, above all with the weather. And after our retirement, we were able to, first part of this year, to take our first trip back to Arizona and spend a little time warming up. And we loved it. Then I came back, and that's when I got the cold, when we hit the cold weather. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and talk about the subject of depression. And I'd like to begin this morning's session with a prayer. If you join me, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege of being here today with brothers in the faith, and for being able in this session to talk about depression. Lord, you know how many people, maybe many of them here, have suffered silently with this illness. And you know how many people that we know continue to suffer with this illness. We pray that you would bless us today as we talk about this and help us to realize that we don't have to feel ashamed if we suffer from an illness any more than we would have to feel ashamed if we're suffering from some kind of a physical illness like a cold. Help us also to realize that no matter what illness we struggle with, in you there is help, and in you there is hope. To that end, bless our time together. We ask it for Jesus' sake. Amen. I'm going to start off by telling you that I'm not here today as a doctor. I am not capable of diagnosing clinical depression. I'm not capable of treating depression. I'm here to tell a very personal story, to share a story with you about depression that occurred in my family, and to offer what I have to offer with 2 goals. One is with the hope and the prayer that we can somehow help to erase the stigma that goes along with depression. And secondly, to realize that there is help and there is hope for people who are experiencing depression. And the outline that I have follows that. I've got a handout that I will give you at some point during this presentation. And on the back of that handout, there's a bunch of discussion questions that perhaps we can get into if we have time, and also answer maybe some of your questions. But try, please, to keep those 2 goals in mind. I'll repeat them, to somehow eliminate the stigma that is associated so broadly with depression. And secondly, to say that there is help, there's hope, and the Lord offers that so richly in His Word. I'm going to begin by telling you my father's story. My father was a pastor. He grew up in a parsonage. He entered the public ministry, and he served his entire ministry in congregations in the Michigan district, predominantly in Toledo, Ohio, and in the Detroit area. My father had a very large congregation the last 30 years of his ministry. He was a very respected, very gifted man in many ways, and a very wonderful father, very wonderful husband, very much loved by his people and loved by his family. But my father was also a man who, for most of his adult life, struggled with what we would call clinical depression. Back in the day, people referred to it as nervous breakdowns. And I will never, ever forget the first time that my dad experienced it. I was just a youngster in 9th grade at Michigan Lutheran Seminary. I came home for the summer break with my siblings, and we walked in the door of our home and walked into the living room, and my father was lying on a couch in the fetal position. And as he proceeded to tell us what he was feeling, he started sobbing like a baby. And you have to appreciate the fact that I never ever had seen my father cry in his entire life up to that point. And he just started sobbing like a baby. And proceeded to tell us that he felt that he couldn't continue at that point in time in the ministry, and that he was going to be asking the congregation for a leave of absence, and that we would be spending the summer in Caledonia, Wisconsin, where my grandfather was a pastor, and my mother's mother also. My dad's mom and dad were there, and my mother's mother lived there, and we would be staying with them for the summer as we tried to wade through this. Now, that particular incident of depression lasted, we were away from Michigan for 3 months, but it was well over a year before Dad started to feel like he was pretty much back to normal. But that was just the first of what I would say probably about 5 or 6 different incidents of depression that he experienced in his adult life. What did it look like? Well, again, this is our personal experience with it. If you ever have taken a stone and thrown it in a pond in a lake somewhere, one of the things you notice that there's all these little waves right around where the stone goes in, and they're real close together and they're real kind of intense, but after a while they kind of spread out a little bit and get further and further apart and even out. That's an analogy that I often use for a person going through a bout with clinical depression, at least from my father's standpoint. The waves, I would say, were symptoms. And I'm going to tell you some of the symptoms that he experienced. He experienced overwhelming sadness. He described that sometimes as like being at the bottom of a deep, dark cave, and it's just a paralyzing sadness. Sometimes it would cause him to just cry a lot and make him almost paralyzed with fear to move or to do anything. He also experienced waves of irritability, where things would just tick him off that ordinarily he would have just rolled with, but they would be volatile about them. At times, he experienced waves of fatigue, where it wasn't that he was so tired he had to sleep, but it just to move his muscles was the greatest chore. He didn't feel like he had the energy to do anything. He had a serious difficulty sleeping, to the point where he had to get prescription for sleeping pills in order to make it through the night. He had a loss of appetite. He lost weight. One time I remember meeting him. My brother and I were at the seminary studying for the ministry. My mom and dad called up, and Dad was going through something, and we met in Michigan City, Indiana, and I remember it was a fall day, and we got out of the car and saw my dad. It was like he was a shell of a man because he had lost so much weight. He just had no appetite whatsoever. Another one of the symptoms was racing thoughts. He just had a hard time just letting his mind, just relax and shut down. And sometimes people would say things, and he would, what we call them processing. Today I hear the word ruminate a lot. He would just go over and over them in his mind. And somebody would make a statement, and he would just build that up and blow it up, and he would make it in the worst possible light by the end of it, because he saw everything in a negative way. I also have to say that sometimes those symptoms became so intense and so multiplied that he would confess to having suicidal thoughts. If I just ended it all, I just could get away from it all. And all of these symptoms, some days they would be real intense and real close together, and other days, you have these little islands where he'd maybe go for a few hours and wouldn't have it so bad. But now with all of this, there were fears. Fears. Am I going to be institutionalized? Am I going to completely lose it so that I can't function anymore?